So we cry.
Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. Can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me.
I can't breathe. You're taking my life from me. I can't breathe. Will anyone fight for me? Oh, 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 I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
Can you feel his pain? You didn't die in vain. We can't let this happen again. It's time to bring about a change.
So we cry for you like good brothers do. And we know this has to change. It has to change. And so we'll say your name. Say your name. So we'll say your name. Say your name. So we'll say your name.
I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. Can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me.
I can't breathe. You're taking my life from me. I can't breathe. Will anyone fight for me? Oh, 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 oh.
young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
Can you feel his pain? He didn't die in vain. We can't let this happen again. It's time to bring about a change.
So we cry for you like good brothers do. And we know this has to change. It has to change. And so we'll say your name. Say your name. So we'll say your name. Say your name. So we'll say your name.
Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. Can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me.
I can't breathe. You're taking my life from me. I can't breathe. Will anyone fight for me? Oh, 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 oh,
I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
Can you feel his pain? He didn't die in vain. We can't let this happen again. It's time to bring about a change.
I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. Can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me. I can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. Somebody help me.
I can't breathe. You're taking my life from me. I can't breathe. Will anyone fight for me? Oh, 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 oh,
I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
Yeah, I think so. All right, sweet. Hey, everyone, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out on this not that warm night. My name is Tunde. I'm the Associate Director of Policy here at the Africa Center, and we're happy to have you all. For those joining us for the first time, just a few words about us and what we do. We're the Africa Center. We are a fairly multidisciplinary institution. Our primary focus is narrative change around the continent of Africa. So for us, we think it's important how the world comes to form its understanding of the place and its diaspora and its people, and what kind of information gets to shape that understanding. And so we put on programs like this fairly frequently. So please sign up for our newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs and some other work that we do. And we're happy to have you guys here. Tonight's program is a conversation with Toluse Olorunnipa. He is the White House bureau chief at the Washington Post. But prior to that, he was at Bloomberg News, where he worked on politics and policy. He's covered 3 presidents at the as the White House bureau chief, and has written for other publications, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and this is his first book, which won the Pulitzer Prize and is a finalist for the National Book Award. And we're really happy to have him. He'll be joined in conversation by Uzodinma Iweala. He's the CEO here at the Africa Center, and a writer in his own right. He is most notable for having written Speak No Evil, Beasts of No Nation, the latter of which has since been adapted to a film. You should go see it. And please give me a hand in welcoming them both to the stage, Uzo and Tolu. Honey, you can have this, you can have that.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Can you guys hear me? And for recording, right, as well. I think we got caught by some folks on the, or by a 6 train or a subway system that is not doing its best in true New York fashion. So we were giving people a little bit of time so we could get started, and I think we'll probably have some folks trickle in. But Tolu, it's really good to be here with you, to meet you, number one, and then to get to talk about this absolutely amazing and transformative book about an incident that we, I guess, all know very well, and that has been transformative, though perhaps not in all the ways that some of us in this country might have wanted. So first of all, welcome to the Africa Center. It's really great to have you here.
Yeah, first time here. Really glad to be here, and thanks to everyone for coming out. I think this can be a nice conversation. Every time I get a chance to talk about the book, I am gratified that people want to hear anything about what we learned as we were writing about George Floyd. And so I hope we'll have time for people to ask questions, because I love hearing what people want to hear about the process of writing a book about a person who became an icon, who started life as an ordinary person, but in death became this icon for racial justice. And so I'm happy to talk about the process of writing the book, how the book started, what we learned along the way, and what we've seen since the book came out a little over a year and a half ago, and anything else that we have on our minds.
Very cool. And so I have my questions here, but let's just start with the book and sort of that idea of George Floyd as an icon. His name is George Floyd. Let's talk a little bit. And that it's interesting in this. When we've done some of these things, if they're more historical books or whatnot, sometimes we have to go through the narrative. But I think everybody in this room and everybody who's watching this has direct experience with what seems like something that happened a long time ago, but really was very recent, really just not that far away. And so you talk about a man that became an icon, but let's talk about the man himself and what it was like to discover that man beyond his name is George Floyd, or say his name.
Yeah, how many people remember sort of what the atmosphere was like in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, May 25th, 2020? I'm sure we saw news coverage, social media feeds. It was very difficult to avoid seeing George Floyd dying on the street, being killed, being murdered by a police officer. And so we all had a different collective national, international experience, which is rare, even in this world of fragmented media. It's rare for us to sort of all pause and watch the same thing in the same way. We have moments like the Super Bowl and other moments where we're all sort of paying attention to something at the same time, but it's very rare for us to have something related to race where everyone is paying attention and almost everyone is expressing some level of outrage. I think how diverse the protests were was a reflection of this being different from some of the things that we've seen in the past. And as a journalist, when you run into a moment like that, you start to ask questions. One of the questions we asked was, why? What was it about George Floyd and his death that made people pause, that made people say, this is not right, that made people leave their homes in the middle of a pandemic and take to the streets and say, no justice, no peace, and all the other things that we heard in the summer of 2020. And so that question of why kind of launched myself and some of my colleagues at the Washington Post on a journey of trying to find out more about George Floyd, the person, find out about who he was before he was killed. And that process led us to some journalistic soul searching in terms of not only do we need to know who George Floyd was as a person, but what does his life tell us about America? And it's rare that someone like George Floyd gets that kind of treatment from a news organization, that this person's life is something that we can use to understand America. It's often that we say someone like George Floyd gets pushed to the margins. They are an outlier. They are not the American experience. But what we learned and what we did in our reporting was sort of allow America to look at itself in the mirror
Right.
through George Floyd's visage. And what we learned was that George Floyd's life experience, even before he was killed, exemplifies how systemic racism operates in America. He was a normal person. He had hopes and dreams. You know, we researched his life by talking to everyone that we could know, everyone that we could find who knew him. And we learned that he had hopes and dreams and wanted to be a Supreme Court justice when he was in second grade, that he was someone who, you know, was reading and writing at grade level as an 8-year-old, which, despite the fact that he grew up in poverty and went to underfunded schools, he was essentially overachieving his peer group. And as we followed his life arc, we saw how his life was intersected with the various forces of systemic racism, starting with the housing system, continuing with the education system, continuing with the criminal justice system, and moving on to the healthcare system. And so we examined all of those systems and how they impacted his life, and got to understand who he was, as well as got to understand more about what America, the America that he knew.
But I want to, because so you do talk about you know, all the systems, and you talk about him the person, and I want to get into him the person. But before that, let's go back, because it's not just about George Floyd in the present that we see.
Right.
You go way back, right? So you take it back to George Floyd's ancestors, who were, and what's interesting is it's not just his in a sense Black ancestors, but also his white ancestors, right? And the story of his great grandfather, right? 3 greats, I'm right about that?
Yeah.
Who was the largest largest African American landowner in all of North Carolina, who was then dispossessed. Like the setup for this is kind of amazing in the context of his life. And so I want you to talk a little bit about finding that out, and the process that brought you to include that in the book before we get to, you know, who he was as a person.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked about that, because in giving what some have called the presidential treatment to George Floyd, in terms of going deep into his life, as you might do a biography of a president or someone else of import, we did genealogical research and found out everything we could about his ancestors. And we found out that his ancestors had worked hard in this country over the course of generations, over the course of centuries, and had been met with the brutality of systemic racism. And so we start with his great-great-great-grandfather, who was born enslaved, was able to get his freedom during the Civil War. And because he was such a hard worker, because he was so industrious, because he was very intelligent, despite not knowing how to read, he was able to start building wealth in this country during the time of Reconstruction, where, you know, Black people were given some level of fairness and some level of access to the nation's wealth.
And not just wealth, but quite a bit of wealth.
Yes, yes.
I mean, 500 acres of land as a Black man in North Carolina.
Yes, it took him decades to do this, working hard with his hands and with his family. He had a large family, and he worked incredibly hard and was able to amass 500 acres, which made him one of the wealthiest landowners in his community, even more wealthy than some white people in the late 1800s. And so one of the reasons we went back and looked at his ancestry is because we wanted to get a sense for why he came into the world poor. We wanted to understand, okay, George Floyd was born in the early 1970s, impoverished, not only normal poverty, but deep poverty, no running water level of poverty in part of his early years. And so we wanted to understand, how does that happen for someone like George Floyd? And what we found was that despite the fact that his family had worked hard over generations, despite the fact that he had had wealth in his lineage, he did not get the benefit of inheriting that wealth, because his great-great-grandfather was dispossessed of his land, specifically because of racial terror that took place in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Essentially, it did not sit well with some of his white neighbors that he was more wealthy than they were.
Right.
And so they realized that he couldn't read. They saw him as an easy mark, and they took advantage of him. They accused him of not paying his taxes. They accused him of signing documents that would allow them to dispossess him of the land that he owned. And because he couldn't read, he couldn't fight back any of these charges. And even if he could fight back, this was a time of intense racism in the legal system. And so no one would listen to him. And so this happened not only with George Floyd's ancestors, but this happened with so many other Black landowners, to the point that more than 90% of the land that was owned by Black Americans in the early 1900s no longer is in Black-owned hands now.
More than 90%.
More than 90%.
And you know what I really love about the book is like you do this so well to, you know, you zoom into his family, but then you zoom out and, for example, talk about the city of Wilmington in North Carolina, where, you know, you talk about systemic racism and the active push against any kind of integration. It's pretty intense. I mean, so tell us a little bit about Wilmington to give context for the dispossession that George Floyd's ancestors also experienced.
Yeah, and I'll preface this part by saying I'd never learned about this when I was in school, and there's this movement to, you know, ban books and restrict how we talk about race and teach race. But these lessons are incredibly important for understanding where we are today. And essentially what happened in Wilmington in 1898 was there was an election that was supposed to be taking place across the state of North Carolina. The city of Wilmington did not have an election that year, but because of the gains that a number of Black Americans had made in the city of Wilmington, they had Black lawmakers, Black city councilmen, Black lawyers, doctors, people who were doing well. In the late 1800s, the election became an election of white grievance. It became
Sounds somewhat familiar.
the importance of learning our history, right?
Right.
These things tend to repeat themselves, and even more so than repeating themselves in that way. The people who were behind the white grievance campaigning realized that they didn't have an election in Wilmington, and there was not going to be an opportunity to seize power through the ballot box. So they staged a coup. It was a successful coup in the United States of America that is not taught in our schools, but they started rounding up lawmakers and telling them that they were no longer in power. At the butt of a gun, they dispossessed a number of people who were leading that city, and they installed instead a white-only city council. They changed the laws to make it very hard for Black people to vote. And what we learned in our book was that it took decades for Wilmington and North Carolina more broadly, and cities and states throughout the South to regain the power that they lost as a result of this white grievance politics that not only was taking place in elections, but also took place in a very violent, deadly coup in the city of Wilmington. And George Floyd's ancestors came from North Carolina. So that's the backdrop.
So that's the backdrop. And they left North Carolina in part because of this violence.
Yes, yeah, they left as they saw their prospects in the state of North Carolina they saw that there was no real future for them there, despite the fact that they worked over the course of several generations in that state. George Floyd's mother left empty-handed for trying to chase a better life in another state because she saw the amount of trauma that she had experienced and that her family had experienced. And so as we think about January 6th, as we think about what we're going through in this country with the racial dynamics of our politics, it's very important to remember where we've come from, to remember what we've experienced, and to draw the linkage between the past and the present. George Floyd is born in 1973, but after his great-great-grandfather lost his land, his family was poor for the next 70 years until he was born. Not because they didn't work hard, not because they weren't industrious, but because after losing your land, you don't have very many opportunities. So you become a sharecropper. And they worked as sharecroppers for the next 60 years. And as a sharecropper, you work hard dawn to dusk, but you don't get any of the benefits of that hard work. And so it's very easy for people to say, you know, slavery, Jim Crow, all that stuff was a long time ago. What's the impact on today?
And the impact is just, it's right before our eyes.
Right. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to tell George Floyd's story, because we realized that people saw him die and they were outraged by his death. But there was so much to be outraged about: the way he lived, the way his family was treated before he even met the cop that killed him, that we thought it was worth exploring his life and understanding who he was as a person, and understanding that he had a humanity that was not only stripped away by the cop that killed him, but was stripped away by these various systems that really made it hard for him to have a chance.
Right. And you and Robert do that so well, like providing that context, not just in the historical accounts of Wilmington or his ancestors, but also just in the grueling nature of what it means to be a sharecropper, and just the violence of that dispossession, and the treachery involved in that. It's a really, really harrowing, infuriating, but such a necessary account. You know, and so now that we have that context and historical context for this person, like a deep historical context. And again, I really love that, because otherwise, you know, if you just started at George Floyd is born in 1973, then you get a tale that is almost, you know, stereotypical, right, in the way that the media likes to portray this man. Oh, he's a Black man from poverty, and poverty is just, you know, essentially the person's fault, right? But you guys don't do that. So now tell us a little bit about George Floyd, all right, Perry, as he was actually called.
Yeah, he was the kind of person that if you met him, it would be hard for you to forget him. And this is just based on interviews with the people that knew him. And he was a memorable person. He was someone that was large, physically large.
When you say physically large, you mean?
He was tall, strong, big, but also he had a presence about him that people remembered. And it's not because he came in and commanded a room, but he came in very aware of his size and very aware of how that might put people at unease because of the way he looked. And he tried to disarm people very quickly. If he came into a room like this, he would meet every single person, shake their hands, ask them who they were, and try to make them feel at ease. And he started doing that at a young age. And one of his brothers told us that they had a conversation with him. They took him to the side and said, "Why do you do that? Why do you always, you know, introduce yourself to every single person in the room when you go in?" And he's like, "Because of my size, people look at me and they're scared, they're afraid. I need to put them at ease and let them know I'm okay, that I'm not a bad person." And so that was the kind of person that he was. And we were able.
He was aware of this, not just in terms of his size, but also in terms of his skin color,
Yes,
as well.
Yes, totally. He knew
from a child.
From childhood, yes. He knew from a very early age that people would look at him and see him in a certain way. And he always saw himself differently from how the stereotype might be. And that goes back to the question about what he wanted to be when he grew up. We were able to talk to a second grade teacher, and she had kept the records for 40 years of her class from 1981. And after he died, she went back to those records and she got one of his assignments, which was the assignment that essentially for Black History Month at this all-Black school, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so she brought out this binder that had all of the students' answers to that question. They had drawn pictures of what they wanted to be and wrote a little 3-sentence paragraph about it when they were in second grade. And so some kids said, "Oh, I want to be a football player," or "I want to be a police officer," or "I want to be the president." George Floyd drew a picture of a Supreme Court justice in a robe with a curly afro, and he said, "I want to be a Supreme Court justice." He wrote that, and he said that essentially he wanted to impart fair justice on the world. He wrote it in a second grader's language, but that was the message that he got across.
Right.
And she remembered that. She remembered that he was different, that he was not sort of the stereotypical kid growing up in poverty, that he wanted to do something different with his life.
Right.
But as he got older, he got taller, he got bigger, and people saw him and they saw the schools that he was in, and they said, the school thing is probably not going to work out for you. These schools are underfunded. Not too many people from these schools get to go into college. You have a way out of the projects. It's through your size, it's through your body. You should focus on the football field.
And so they pushed him in that
They
direction.
pushed him in that
But
direction.
before we talk about football, I mean, just to go again on character, there's one scene that you guys describe in this book of him with his friend Po Boy, right? Who, you know, the scene where they meet for the first time. Can you just describe that? Because I think that really characterizes not just what you were talking about in terms of who he was as a person, but also who he would be.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you brought that up. There's a scene in the book where George Floyd, who was new to his neighborhood in Houston, was just finally getting to make friends in the neighborhood. He was a shy kid. He moved to an insular neighborhood where people were like, I don't really know you, but he started to make friends. He started to feel at home. And now he has his crew. He has his crew of young kids. They're probably 10, 11 years old. They're playing basketball together. They're on the YMCA team together. And so he's feeling at home. And they see another kid from a competing team from across town, from a rival team, going through their neighborhood, and they're like, who is that kid? That kid looks like someone that we played against. And they realize, okay, this is one of the kids that played on a competing team, sort of scrawny, small. And the group of boys are like, let's go rough that guy up. Let's go rough him up a little bit. They're coming into our neighborhood unannounced, you know, sort of a turf battle kind of situation. And George Floyd was the one that was like, no, don't do that. Like, what's the point of like beating up a smaller kid? And instead of doing that, he calls off his friends and goes over and talks to the little boy who ended up being one of his best friends into adolescence and into adulthood, named Po Boy. And instead of what would have been like this kid getting jumped and beat up, George Floyd becomes sort of offers an olive branch and welcomes him into the fold. And now this kid gets to play on the basketball team.
But not just that, welcomes him to the fold and then also brings him home.
Yeah, yes. So the next part of the story is that this kid was actually moving into the neighborhood, and that's why he was there. And he moved into the neighborhood and became fast friends with George Floyd. They're going into middle school together. They're best friends. But then a point comes when the kid's mom is going to move out of the neighborhood, and that's going to require him to leave the school. And so George Floyd takes Po Boy to his mom, to George Floyd's mom, and essentially asks his mom if his friend can stay with them so that he can stay in the same school. And his mom surprised him by saying yes. And so he brings in his friend, and now they're sharing a room, they're sharing clothes, they're playing on the same teams together. And it was the kind of thing that exemplified the kind of person he was. People would tell me and my co-author that he would give you the shirt off of his back. He was the kind of person that would really show up for his friends and really be there. And it started from a very young age. And so even as he got older and he got bigger and people thought that he was intimidating, he still kept that spirit. And a lot of people told us that spirit came from his mom. And if you watch the video of his death, he's calling out for his mom who had passed. But that closeness to his mom sort of shone through in his character. She was the person that not only let this kid come live with them, but sort of had an open door policy in her home for people. She would cook for the neighborhood.
And then this neighborhood. So just tell us a little bit about the neighborhood that he grew up in, the Third Ward in Houston, because I think page 14, you talk a little bit about and you mentioned it, just how intense and grinding the poverty was of this neighborhood.
Yeah, he lived in a public housing project in Houston's Third Ward, completely segregated, an all-Black housing unit. Come completely neglected by the state that had created it to be segregated in the 1940s and then left it segregated into the 60s, 70s, 80s when George Floyd gets there. And this is just a place of deep poverty. There's no getting around it. There's no sugarcoating it. This is a place of institutionalized, racialized poverty in a government-funded housing project that was designed to keep Black people in a certain part of the city and out of another part of the city. But despite those efforts, it became a place of camaraderie, a place of unity, a place of intuitiveness, and that people made a lot out of very little. And it was a place where George Floyd got to know some very important lessons about family, about culture, about unity, about loyalty. And despite the impoverished nature of this community, people felt a kinship. They felt like they needed to take care of one another. People looked after each other's kids. And George Floyd's mom was one of the matriarchs of this community, where she would have an open door policy. She would cook for other people in the neighborhood, take in other people's kids.
But this is also while working.
Yes, yes. While trying to work and feed her family, she happened to work just across the street from the communities, and so she, people would come by and see her at her job. She worked at a fast food restaurant, and this was a place where you just sort of had to have grit to get by. And this is where George Floyd came of age, and it's where he learned some of the key lessons of life that he kept with him. And this is a place where he kept coming back to over the course of his life. It's an over-policed place. It was a place of a lot of the institutional racism that we document in the book happened at this specific housing project. But despite that, it's a place of great resilience, and we tried to make sure that shone through in the book, and a place of great Black joy as well. I mean, people, despite the circumstances, made sure that they found joy, that they created an atmosphere of joy. They protected one another from the hardship around them by creating that atmosphere of joy. And George Floyd was part of that as well.
Right, and I think that comes through, just the joy and the optimism, and it shines through, in his, like, the joking nature of his personality, in the football games, in the fact that he was so aware of the contradiction of this super big guy against this almost pacifist mentality that he had playing football. I mean, it's just such a wonderful juxtaposition that you guys have on the page there that really makes him shine. But at some point in time, George Floyd's life starts being less optimistic. And you guys in the book kind of peg this at when he is about to graduate from high school or tries to go to college. And it just seems like where maybe as a young person, that joy and that optimism is enough to propel him and shield him in a way. But then he runs headlong or headfirst, right, into what it means to be a big Black man in America, with the option of using your body to earn your keep, and what that means for your life prospects.
Totally. There's a scene in the book where George Floyd is at the end of his junior year, and he's hanging out with his football buddies, and school is over, and it's the end of the school year, and they're about to go into summer, and they're all sort of just laying on the grass, talking about the future, essentially, talking about what they want to do with their lives, talking about what they want to do in the future. And some of the kids said that, they wanted to go into the military. Some wanted to just get a job. Some wanted to think about college. And so the question turns to George Floyd, and, he's the jokester of the group. So everyone's thinking he's going to try to, crack a joke or say something humorous or say something funny. And he gets deadly serious, and he says, "I want to be big. I want to touch the world." And that's it. He doesn't elaborate beyond that. But a lot of people who were there remembered that scene, especially in the aftermath of his death. And they remembered that was close to the period of time where the hope that was exhibited in that statement started to be further snuffed out by these systemic pressures. And so the next year, he is a star athlete. He is being recruited by colleges. It looks like he has a way out of his circumstances, but the same pressures that led people to steer him towards the football field and toward athletics and away from academics are present in the subpar academic experience that he's having. He's not being taught the basics. He's being passed through classes without
that scene of when the teacher just says, if you guys sit in the back and make no noise, I'll pass you, is just, I mean, let's talk about this. I'm just
yeah. That's so emblematic of that dichotomy between being told to focus on athletics and having your academics completely neglected. And so in this scene, some of George Floyd's friends are making noise in class, and they're all football players. And so the teacher says, hey, football players, yeah, you guys just go to the back of the class. Don't worry about it. I'll pass you. Just be quiet. And they do that. They don't learn anything over the course of the semester. They get passing grades. They get to play football. And all of this comes to a head when they have to take a state standardized test that will determine whether or not you can graduate in Texas.
So you've gone from a boy who was at or above grade level in reading to now somebody who has to take this exam 3 times.
Exactly. He does not pass the exam the first couple of times, and now he's in his senior year where it's do or die. He needs to pass his exam to graduate from high school. He's doing great on the football field. He's being recruited by all of these colleges. He's having a stellar season. His team goes to the state championship, and it seems like everything is set up for his success, but there is no investment in his educational experience. Instead, he's stuck in this underfunded school. He's being told that if he just focuses on sports, he'll be fine. And
so he's got almost a coin toss's chance of getting out of poverty.
Exactly. And he was not very good at taking tests. He was a smart person, but he was not very good at taking tests. And there's a debate to be had over the value of standardized testing, but that is the way that you graduate in Texas, and you have to pass this exam. And so at the end of his senior year, he fails the exam and is told that he's not going to be able to graduate from high school. And he's just totally gutted by that. He is depressed over it. He sees his life dreams, the window and the door to his life dreams beginning to close. And that is sort of the beginning of the tailspin, I'd say.
When his life just goes like this.
Yes.
And so I want to, because, now we're into, a very interesting place, not just for this young man who comes of age in this world at a time when it really feels like, systematically there's an aggressive push to make sure that he doesn't succeed. But there's also the issue of who he is now, the icon, right? And the battle, I guess, over image, right? Kind of the what I would say the cartoonification, right? To make this person a saint versus the actuality of his life. And now you, as a Black person writing about this, like this figure who everybody knows, you have to get into some of this stuff. And how do you do that? How do you get in there? And what are the fault lines you're aware of as you're writing about a man who did have a checkered past?
It's very difficult because there's, on one side, the cartoonification to make him a saint. On the other side, there's a ton of misinformation, exaggerating things that he did that were not great and trying to make that his entire story. And so as a journalist, we have to grapple with both sides of the equation. We have to find the truth and separate that from fiction because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And we did not shy away from telling his full story. And the people that we spoke to said that he would not want us to shy away from telling his full story because he was very transparent about his demons, about his struggles. He wrote about them in his diary. He wrote poems to himself about the struggles that he was facing. He was a very introspective person who admitted that he had challenges. And so we were committed to the truth and the facts and the fullness of someone's story, with the important recognition that we are all complex beings that have light and darkness within us, that have our good days and bad days. And
It's just that for some people, the consequences of a bad day can literally be deadly.
exactly. And that's what we wanted to showcase as we followed him from high school into a brief experience in college, and then his experience post college when he had to drop out. And then the criminal justice system is the next thing that's sort of waiting for him. And so we had to write about his experience in the criminal justice system, write about his decisions, some of them not ideal, but also the way those decisions were treated by a very harsh and brutal criminal justice system and an unequal criminal justice system.
So let's talk a little bit about some of those decisions, but also within the context of misinformation and actuality. So, let's pick, for example, his drug dealing or drug use, the misinformation part of that, and then what actually he experienced. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. There's a lot to the story. But the short answer is that George Floyd got caught up in the vicissitudes of the country's drug laws that are incredibly unequal and harsh, especially at the time that he was coming of age with the war on drugs. And so he was arrested several times over the course of his 20s and early 30s for nonviolent petty drug possession offenses.
I mean, for things as low as what, like $3?
Yeah.
And locked up for 6 months to 5 years.
Yes, yeah. Often he was locked up for a year or more for essentially having a small amount of marijuana or other substances on him, not even for dealing, but just for simple possession charges that were not being prosecuted or investigated or even considered in a number of other settings like college campuses. They were being prosecuted at an incredibly high rate in the housing project where he lived, in the Black community that he grew up in. And we were able to get figures, and the fact that arrests and incarceration for simple drug possession went up, I think, by 3 times over the course of about a decade as George Floyd was coming of age in the Black community. And this is for young Black men, and for their white counterparts, it was flat. So you have a 300% increase on one side and flat on the other side. And that is not reflective of drug use.
Right.
That's reflective of the way drug use is prosecuted and investigated. And so often George Floyd was forced to plead guilty or no contest because he couldn't afford a lawyer, and take a plea deal to these simple drug crimes and essentially take time served or take a 6-month sentence or take a 1-year sentence in order to do his time and get back to his family. And so those kinds of petty arrests were riddled throughout his criminal record, including for things like trespassing, walking through his own neighborhood. There was one time we saw an arrest record where the officer asked him what he was doing as he was walking, and he said that he did not look like he belonged where he was, even though he was in his own neighborhood. And so,
I mean, there was, I think we were talking about people being arrested for driving too slow, which oddly enough brought up, I don't know if you remember this Chris Rock skit where he talks about the person who's like, and talking about the absurdity of being arrested for driving too slow, and yet here it is. But I want to talk because there are the stats, there's this sort of the reporting on it, and then there's the very real human aspect of what it means to be locked up. And I think you guys talk about this in relation to George Floyd's claustrophobia, which plays a role later on. But I mean, please, like, let's get into like some of the mental health impacts, but like very specifically that claustrophobia.
Yeah, and I mentioned how George Floyd was caught up in the war on drugs. He also was dealing with mental health issues and addiction issues, and those were treated as a form of criminality as opposed to a medical issue and an illness that needed to be treated. And because he was treated with that level of harshness, he was thrown into jail cells while he was dealing with mental illness and crying out for help. We got access to some of his intake records at some of these prisons, and he was essentially admitting that he was mentally ill at times, that he was dealing with demons, that he was struggling, and that he needed help. And rather than give him help, they put him in a jail cell, and that made things work incredibly worse for him. And so he first developed an intense form of claustrophobia while he was being incarcerated. And that followed him throughout the course of his life, up until the last moments of his life, where he was saying he was claustrophobic as he was being killed. And so one of the things we were able to do was really drill down on the after effects of what some might say is a petty drug crime that only has 6 months in prison or a year in prison. These were really dark times for George Floyd. He was really struggling as he was being locked up. And the so-called deterrent effect of incarceration was not effective in any way. Instead, he got worse. There was no kind of rehabilitative approach to the prison system in Texas. Instead, it was really lock him up and throw away the key. And
that's what they did.
That's exactly what they did.
Until he got out. And then he was in Minneapolis because he was trying to get away from that system.
Exactly. Not only do you have the mental anguish of being incarcerated, but you have to deal with the scarlet letter that comes on you as a felon or as an ex-felon, as someone who was formerly incarcerated, as you're trying to get a job, especially in the state of Texas. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs that you cannot even qualify the license for if you have even a petty drug offense on your record. He couldn't be a barber. He couldn't be a plumber. He couldn't be a real estate agent. He couldn't work for the state in any capacity. And so he found that doors were being closed to him as he was trying to get himself on the straight and narrow in Texas. And that is the reason why he left Texas to move to Minneapolis later in life, as he was trying to reset his life, as he was trying to get a fresh start. He realized that if he wanted to get health insurance, if he wanted to get an opportunity to work, if he wanted to get a trucker's license, which is one of his final dreams in life, he had to move and leave his state because—
Leave his daughter?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And he left thinking that he'd be able to get himself together, get financial stability, and get custody of his daughter and be able to come back. It ended up being the last place he moved because he was killed there. But it's just a sign of the tragic nature of his life arc that he makes the choice. I want to get better. I want to get into rehab. I want to get help. I want to get healthcare. I want to get a job. I want to take care of my family. I want to do all the things that you would expect someone who's trying to get their life together to do. And rather than getting that, he's killed by an agent of the state in the state of Minneapolis.
It's just, I mean, we all know, and I want to talk about that in a second, but just very briefly, the sort of thought process around he's in this system, and you guys make a point of talking about the prison system that he was in, which was a for-profit prison system, one of the largest in the United States of America, which kind of takes us right back to his ancestors being enslaved.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked about that. He was sent away to a private prison in the city of Bartlett, Texas. This is a city that its entire economy is built around the prison system. The prison Private prison is the largest employer. It's a largely white town, largely Black and Latino inmates. And the prison is the largest employer in the city. It pays the largest tax bill in the city. It funds essentially the city's full operations because it is the economic engine of an entire city that had been a cotton shipping town before, but industry had left, and now this is the new industry. This is a new way that they
Black
are able,
bodies.
essentially. And so George Floyd gets filtered into this system where he is now the latest form of economic opportunity for a city outside of his community. And that was one of the most intense forms of systemic racism that he faced, because we found out that when they tried to close this prison later on after he had left, the mayor of the town wrote to the state begging them not to close the prison because the prison was such an important economic driver for
In other
this.
words, send us more Black people so we can make more money.
Exactly. And so you ask, why are so many people being locked up? Why is this mass incarceration happening? And you see the profit motives. You see that the corporation that owned this prison saw its stock go up 30% during the time that George Floyd was locked up. And they were doing this in other pockets of the country. And their goal is to get as much revenue as possible, spend as little as possible. So what kind of services was George Floyd getting while he was locked up? No rehab.
No heat no AC in the summer,
No-
no heat in the winter.
Yeah, and you talk about the claustrophobia and all the other forms of anguish that he faced, and no rehabilitation. So
So how is somebody supposed to come out and deal with what is what we now know, according to the reporting, is a serious mental health issue that before was a character flaw?
right. And the profit motive is to have more recidivism, to have people cycle through the prison system.
Right.
That's the profit motive. So what's the benefit of putting
Treating
someone
people.
through treatment or rehabilitation or giving them services that would help them become active members of society when you could just sort of expect them to come back into the system and become another paycheck? And so the fact that not only was this corporation making money, but this entire city was built around the economic engine of this prison that was consisting mostly
But
of
not
Black.
just that, pension funds.
Yeah.
Universities, endowments are all
Right.
invested in these, so basically George Floyd being incarcerated is making this whole system a hell of a lot of money.
Totally.
And, and everybody's acting now like, oh, no, we weren't a part of that.
Yeah, it's just peeling back the layers of how embedded this form of institutional racism is in our society, was really eye-opening for me. I wasn't aware of how many tentacles there were that reached into different parts of our society, and how unknowingly a lot of us are participating in these structures, whether it's through our pension system or through the way that we participate in the economy. It's become very difficult in some cases to understand how this systemic racism is happening and stop it from happening, because it's become so embedded within the system. And so that was something that was really eye-opening for me, that George Floyd was sent to this prison and a ton of people were making money off of it. And that is one reason why he was not getting any of the help that he needed. And that's one of the reasons why he ended up leaving his state to try to get to a place where he could get the help that he needed.
To the place that eventually killed him.
Right.
And so now, I mean, this book is so incredible and you guys go so deep, but and I don't want to, I mean, look, let's just do it because we all saw it, right? That 9 minutes and 29 seconds. But rather than talking about that, I'm really interested in what it's like to have to report on that. And to have to watch that over and over. I mean, we all watched it, but I mean, you guys had to do that in a very different way for this book to reconstruct exactly what happened. What I mean, what does that do to you as a person beyond being totally the reporter?
Yeah, it's essentially trauma reporting, but it's trauma reporting from a perspective that, so as journalists, we're told to remove ourselves from the situation, don't be emotionally tied to it, be neutral, nonpartisan, and detached. But it's hard to do that when you're living in a body that makes it much easier for you to identify with the person who is on the ground, because you know that if a couple of things hadn't worked out for you in life, that could have been you on the ground, and that could still be you on the ground if a police officer is having a bad day. And so there's the trauma of realizing that that could be you. There's the trauma of realizing that there's limited power to do anything about stopping the next George Floyd. For me, what was useful was to remember that by bearing witness, by writing about George Floyd, by allowing people to see him in a new light, we could do something about it. We could do something to potentially stop the next George Floyd, to have someone see the next person that maybe looked like a George Floyd and stop and pause before they think about them in a stereotypical way. Maybe realize that the person might have had hopes and dreams that you might not be aware of and that are different from what you might expect. And so that was one of the goals of the book, realizing that, you know, we're not in the position to throw bad cops in prison or strip them of their badges, but we can start to change the culture and start to change the way people look at each other by allowing them to see the person that they thought they knew through this video in a new light and with a new form of humanity. And so it was really hard to spend as many minutes and hours as we did engaging with the video, watching it in slow motion, watching it over and over, seeing him die from different angles. It was really, really difficult. And I'm still dealing with some of the demons from that. But I like to think that the outcome of being able to understand more about George Floyd and help other people understand more about him was worth the effort. And the last thing I'll say is that just getting to know George Floyd was a benefit, despite the trauma of having to watch him die. Getting to know who he was outside of the video was a treat, and we wanted to put that in the hands of people who got to read the book as well.
Yeah, and you know, thank you very much for saying that, because I think I don't think people often realize how intensely difficult it can be to spend time with this kind of material. And you know, you talked about it for yourself, but you also talk about it for some of the people who bore witness to that on the day. And I think they don't get really that much play, for want of a better word, in a lot of the discussion now. Yes, George Floyd, you know, in a lot of senses, George Floyd, the very flattened person or character, but then all these people who just watched him die in real time and couldn't do anything.
Yeah, and they became the backbone of the legal case against Derek Chauvin. I mean, you think about some of the witnesses that you had. You had an EMT who was off duty. You had a mixed martial arts fighter who could understand what a choke looked like. You had an older Black man from the neighborhood who could understand sort of the way the neighborhood normally operates and knew who the cops were and were able to, and you had a 9-year-old girl who was saying, get off him. Like even a child could understand that this is wrong. And then you had the brave 16-year-old Darnella Frazier who was recording and who really bore witness and was willing to train the camera and watch this heinous act taking place, didn't run away, didn't move back, but bore witness for the entire world. And her video ended up, you know, going viral and being the video that everyone got to see before we got access to the police body cam and the other footage. And not only did she take the video, but she posted it and set off this fire that went around the world. And so I think that the witnesses who saw George Floyd be killed, were really the unsung heroes of this effort. I think without them, you don't have a white police officer being convicted, which had never happened in Minneapolis. And you don't have the entire world, including people who in the past have been unwilling to engage with the idea that Black Lives Matter or that these police killings are wrong. Even some of those antagonists were willing to say, okay, this is wrong. And even some of them ended up going to march and protest. And so I think without those witnesses, without people bearing witness, without people speaking out and saying this is wrong in real time, which you don't always get. Sometimes you get it after the fact, but they were saying it in real time. I think without that, you don't get the kind of movement that you ended up having.
Yeah, and it's really powerful, and when you talk about it, you then talk about it within the context of the trial and the involvement of his family. And if we can just briefly, as we start to think about some of the more global questions, if you can talk about what that trial meant from a tactical perspective, because you get into those details which are really interesting. I mean, I'm not one who likes reading about courtroom dramas, but you guys really bring it out. That, but then against like the real emotions, because we see the Al Sharptons, we see the Ben Crumps, we see those like larger than life figures, but that's also against his brothers, his sister, right, his friends who are caught up in this and forced into essentially to become activists with little training in real time
while grieving. That's
while
the other
grieving.
thing. Like that was some of the most difficult reporting we had to do because we had to witness the family often breaking down as they were trying to carry all of this
And you were
weight.
doing this in real time. You were covering this as it was happening. This is not you doing historical research. This is not you, like going after the fact and interviewing people. You were there.
Yes, yeah, and we were very grateful to George Floyd's family for being open with us and being willing to share with us what they were going through in real time, because I think the rawness of those emotions came through because we were there as these things were happening. They had to deal with being activists, unwilling activists at times, while grieving, while being called upon to tell people to be peaceful, even though they were angry at times, they were frustrated at times, they were sad at times. I think that is something that doesn't get enough attention. The fact that his family was dealing with so much emotionally and kept it together and showcased the power of the Black family in a way that we don't always get to see in these moments of great unrest. But it was very clear that they were going through an emotional roller coaster as the trial was playing out, not just in the immediate aftermath of his death, but almost a year later when this trial was taking place, they had to essentially be re-traumatized by not only seeing all the footage of him dying, but also hearing about what other witnesses were seeing and trying to grapple with the fact that they didn't know how the story was going to end. There was no guarantee that Derek Chauvin would be convicted. In fact, based on history, it was more likely that he would go free. But they had to just sort of live through the ups and downs and the emotional roller coaster of not only seeing the person who had killed their loved one, but not knowing whether or not a jury of his peers would convict him of what they all saw clearly as murder.
It's really, really arresting. Maybe not the right word, but just to go through and to read about that and to read about their just their struggle. And then of course that struggle within the context of the global, the national and then global movement, which I think everybody here would have experienced. And if you were in a city like New York, right, or DC, not to talk of Minneapolis, but you would have experienced in real time. And I mean, remember getting caught up in going to and then getting caught up in the sweep of protests, which did change the world. Maybe not entirely in the way that we would have liked or that his family wanted to see based off of their involvement, their engagement, but we can't deny that there was a change.
For sure. Some of the conversations that we're having now are completely different than the conversations we were having in early 2020 or prior to George Floyd's death. Systemic racism is now sort of a part of the national zeitgeist. People are talking about it as if it's a settled debate in many cases. Corporate influence has been willing to accept the idea that they need to change, that if we don't make changes in a very aggressive way, that we're going to be stuck with these same inequalities. So you've seen some movement in at the corporate spaces. You've seen some movement more broadly in the culture. You've seen, diversity, equity, and inclusion be elevated in a way that was not happening before George Floyd. I don't think you have a Black vice president without George Floyd being killed, for the first Black female Supreme Court justice, a number of other firsts that probably would not have happened as quickly without George Floyd being killed. And
we might not have had Biden as president.
It's quite possible. Yeah, there was an activism that has led to results in a number of different facets of our society. You have at the local level a number of police departments that have banned chokeholds, banned no-knock warrants, banned a number of these other tactics that have led to deaths of unarmed people. And it hasn't happened yet at the national level. There hasn't been a federal George Floyd Policing Act passed, but we can't deny that things have changed in some ways. And so for the activists that took to the streets, for the family members that wanted George Floyd's death to mean more than just another death of a Black man, it's a mixed bag, right? They've got the movement that has happened and the pride they have in being able to achieve those changes, but also the disappointment in not seeing things move further or more quickly, and realizing that the moment largely seems to have passed and now we're in a moment of backlash.
Right. And that backlash is, whether you're talking about Bill Ackman's verbal diarrhea or, the likes of, I don't know, the Elon Musks of the world tweeting out of a storm about DEI, it's real.
It's totally real. And it's something that is expected when you have a moment of great change. Something we write about in the book was this quote of the Newton's law of civil rights, that when you have one step forward, you potentially are going to have one step in the opposite direction, because of this country's long history of systemic racism, and understanding that that kind of change towards more justice does not come easily. It does not come without a response. It does not come without a fight in some cases. And so we're in the midst of that struggle now. And we are dealing with some of the backlash now, and we're dealing with some of the people who said, I took to the streets after George Floyd was killed, but now I think things are going too far. And so you're losing some of the people who seemed like they were open to the conversation before. And so how you deal with that is a very important part of seeing where this thing goes next. I don't think we've gotten yet to a place where the people who took to the streets after George Floyd died feel like the people who were standing next to him, who they didn't expect to be standing next to them, would still be there if they were to take to the streets again.
Right.
And so that is the challenge of the modern version of this movement.
Right. And so before I open it up to the audience for questions, I want to ask you one last question, which is, you are a Nigerian American, which means that as the child of immigrants, right? Like, you occupy a particular space in this whole question of race and what it means to interact with American concepts of race, and also what it means to write about it. So, I'm interested in that angle and what that brought up for you.
I think the time that became most searing for me was when I examined the linkage between George Floyd's ancestry and his modern reality. The fact that his ancestors were enslaved and worked hard and experienced that level of poverty over the course of generations. It's just a completely different experience from my experience with America, and how my parents came here willingly. And despite discrimination and challenges they faced, they didn't have that deep-seated level of abuse in our family lineage in America that would make it more difficult as I was being asked to sort of believe in the American dream, as I was being asked to believe that hard work pays off. And so I realized that there's a certain level of privilege that comes with that, not having that kind of scarring in your family lineage in the land that you're growing up in and asked to believe in. And so that was something I had to grapple with as I see my own role in this space, realizing that I come to this with a certain level of privilege, even as I deal with a lot of the same challenges and obstacles that George Floyd has. When people look at me, they sometimes use the same stereotypes that they used about George Floyd. But I think just sort of realizing that we all come to this with different perspectives, different levels of privilege, and we have to figure out what we do with that and how we use that to benefit other people, how we empathize with other people, and how we are open to looking at the challenges that people face and not demonizing someone based on their lot in life, based on, their presentation. I had to grapple more with some of that personally and say, what am I doing to make sure that I'm passing the baton on to the next generation, that I'm making sure that someone else who didn't have the privileges that I have has a shot, and that I'm not taking up space without giving back. And so that part, I think, was most impactful for me, is just sort of understanding that George Floyd had a lot of baggage that I am privileged to not have, and I need to make sure that I use the privilege that I have, that lack of baggage, to lighten someone else's burden.
So thank you. So I'll ask if anyone has questions, a couple of questions, and then we can round up. Sure. We have a mic just for recording purposes as well.
I thank you for speaking and sharing with us. Something you highlighted is how there has been a consistent pattern in terms of backlash, in terms of progress of Black people in the United States, whether it was Jim Crow in response to Reconstruction, or the war on crime in response to the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, or even today, the backlash to DEI. In your, I guess, analyses of these moments, have you seen any patterns in terms of the response to the backlash that help progress Black Americans throughout history?
That's a great question. That is a really, really insightful question. I'm going to try to see if I can find an insightful answer. I would say that in looking at the ebbs and flows of racial progress, one of the things that has stuck out is the willingness of Black Americans to stay the course and to keep fighting, even as they faced backlash, even after Martin Luther King is assassinated, even after we see people stripped of their rights that they had fought so hard for after Reconstruction. And that's one of the through lines of the book, is sort of the resilience of the Black community. And I think that resilience has paid dividends, and there's been sort of this built up sentiment that the Black community will not yield, even as they face backlash, even as sometimes they have to retreat as the backlash is taking place. They are the community in this country that has faced so much hardship and has always continued to believe in the American dream and the Constitution, and that if they continue to fight, that progress would be better for the next generation. And so I have seen that level of resilience pay dividends in terms of when the next opportunity comes for racial progress, there is always a group that's ready to jump right into it. And one example I would use is that, the Black Lives Matter movement was working over the course of several years before George Floyd died. We had Trayvon Martin, we had the other hashtag movements that didn't get as much attention. And there were periods of wilderness where People weren't paying attention to Black Lives Matter. They weren't paying attention to racial justice activists. But when George Floyd died, the fact that they had been working in the trenches, the fact that they had been building their skill set, the fact that they had been creating this network of activism was able to kick into gear when people were ready to pay attention. And then all of a sudden, you have what looks like an organic movement of people just taking to the streets, but what is actually building and standing on the shoulders of what activists had been doing for several years, starting from Trayvon Martin all the way through. And that is what sparks this international activism. It's organic, yes, but it is as organized as it is as effective as it is as powerful and uniting as it is because there had been all of the work being done. So I think continuing to work, even sometimes behind the scenes or sometimes in the shadows, as the backlash is taking place, the activists that are putting in that work pays dividends in spades when the country is sort of ready to pay attention. And it's sometimes unfortunate that it takes the death of someone like George Floyd for the country to wake up. But I think being able to be organized and to seize the moment when that moment happens is one thing that I've seen happen that has been effective in the past. And I very much expect that to be the case in the future as well.
Yeah. Questions?
Well, thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. I'm French, and when George Floyd died, I was in Paris. And I just want to talk a little bit about the BLM movement, because it felt like Blackout Tuesday was like the explosion of the BLM movement. But so it was really interesting to me to see that white folks would be like interested in Black people's struggle. But in the same time, they weren't really interested in like the in-depth meaning of the movement. And so we had like in Paris one big protest with only Black people, and then protests every week with only white people. And so like personally, I didn't do Blackout Tuesday because I saw just people that were racist doing Blackout Tuesday. So would you say that like this period was kind of the fall of the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of like this organization, not the symbol or the icon, but just like hypocrisy and just like fake people using this to kind of blackwashing?
That's a good question. I think it's TBD. It remains to be seen what the long-term impact will be. I do think that there has been some retrogression in the movement, and that there are a number of people who have been turned off from Black Lives Matter, the organization, or the part of the movement that seems more surface level, that seems more for clout, that seems more for social media, and is not truly about making change. I think some people have seen a lot of that because there was a lot of that in the aftermath of George Floyd. It became cool to say that you believed in Black Lives Matter, that you believed that Black Lives mattered. And it became easy to do social media activism as opposed to really questioning how we can change systems. And so I think that turned a lot of people off because a lot of those were fair weather allies who were able to go to the streets in the aftermath of George Floyd, but then they disappeared and they were not willing to go beyond holding up a sign and taking a picture or posting something on social media about George Floyd and take the next step. And I think that's the challenge of some of these mass movements, is that you're always going to have people that are fair weather allies that glom onto a movement because it seems like it's in vogue and not be willing to do anything that's uncomfortable. And so that's going to turn off a lot of people who do want to see activism if they feel like a movement is being co-opted by people who don't want to actually do anything. And that's the big challenge. That's something that we saw in a significant amount in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. And I think that's part of the reason why the backlash was able to gain steam so quickly, because people who were antagonists of the movement realized that a lot of the people that were taken to the streets were not really serious and were doing it for a sense of belonging, doing it because it seemed cool, doing it because they felt like they might be put to shame if they weren't involved. And so that was a weakness of the movement that was exploited by people who wanted to create this backlash. And so that has led to some disillusionment with the movement. And I don't know what happens next as a result of that, but I think dealing with that disillusionment is going to be the first step in regrouping for whatever the next part of the movement is.
Thank you.
We'll take one more question if anyone has one. And then...
Thank you for the book. Given what you do, you see more than we do see, and you're in a position to know more than we can ever know. So given your experience writing this book and what you do as a journalist, are you optimistic about race relations in this country, and how so?
Man, these questions.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a tough one. I will say, in relation to the first answer I gave, there's optimism that is derived from the strength and resilience of the Black community. I think that has been proven over and over and over again, that it is resilient in the face of massive resistance and massive oppression. And I think it will continue to be resilient. And I think that is what gives me hope, more so than the idea that the country will suddenly wake up and change. I think it'll be a slow process. I think these movements will never be a straight line. There will always be zigzags and forward progress before retrenchment and more forward progress. So I think over the long arc, I am optimistic. I don't want to neglect the change that has happened, because there has been change. And so it's easy to be pessimistic, but I try to look at things objectively. And I think in doing that and realizing the resilience of the Black community, along with the changes that have been taken place, I am optimistic, but I'm cautiously optimistic, because it just takes a couple of things going the wrong way for racial justice to really backslide. It's like going up a hill, and if you get to the tipping point, you can go forward or you can go backwards. And I think we're pretty close to one of those tipping points, with a number of things in the balance, not the least of which is an election this year. And I think if we reach that tipping point and we don't move forward, there could be significant retrenchment. And so that's why my optimism is cautious, because I do think that there is the risk of race relations deteriorating in a very significant way, as opposed to advancing at a slow and steady pace.
Tolu, thank you very much for being here with us tonight, but more importantly, for writing this amazing, prize-winning, transformative book. So before we let you off the stage, my question is, you said it, it's an election year. You know, we know you down there at the White House. I'm not gonna ask you that question, but I am gonna ask you, depending on who wins, what's next?
For me or for the
you.
country? Okay, for me, that's an easier question. I don't know what's going to happen to the country. I will have to take a break and then decide what I want to do. I would like to actually write another book, but I just will need to take some space to figure out what that might be. And, you know, I do think that if Trump wins another term, there will be a temptation to bear witness to that part of history and to stand up some journalistic guardrails in defense of democracy and values. But it's also an exhausting prospect of, you know, the idea of bearing witness for 4 years or longer. That is something
You
to,
didn't just say it longer, but
that is something to consider. So I think I'll have to take a little bit of time to think about it. But ideally, I'd love to do more long form work that lands with bigger impact than what I do in my daily journalistic life. But TBD, we'll see.
all right. Well, look, thank you so much for being here with us. For all of you, we have books in the back. Tolu will do a little bit of a signing. Remember to follow us at the Africa Center on all of our socials, Instagram, Facebook, all the things that you guys twiddle away with on your phones. And please do come back. As you know, we do these talks. We have film screenings, we have arts exhibitions, but it's really your house to come and listen to some of our leading luminaries who are really setting the path for us. So come on back, and you come on back as well.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.